we're destroying the system that allowed us to evolve. And when we destroy biodiversity, we're basically committing suicide.
I am honored to be joined today by Professors Paul R. Ehrlich and Gerardo Ceballos. Thank you both so much for being on Urgent Futures.
Thank you very much.
Our great pleasure.
We are gathered to discuss this incredible book, Before They Vanish. And so I think it's fitting to invite you both to share a little bit about the origins of this book, both long and near term. So basically, what were the animating research interests? Obviously, you're both storied conservationists, but just a couple bullet points for how you got to publishing a book like this. Gerardo, you're closest to me in the screen, so I'm going to start with you.
Okay, perfect. Well, in 1996, I went from my university in Mexico to Stanford to do a sabbatical with Paul. And at that time, we start to talk about these issues on extinctions and population extinctions and the magnitude of the crisis. And we discussed if we were in the mass extinction or not. And then our work started to evolve, and we started to publish papers. And then in 2014, we published a paper, a book. It's called The Annihilation of Nature. That is like the previous book of that. And in 2019, I went back to Stanford to another sabbatical. And we have every possible Tuesday, we have a lunch together with other colleagues, Rodolfo Dirso sometimes, and Hal Mooney. We call the Catapa dialogues because there were some Catapa trees there. And it was wonderful because we discussed all these ideas. And it was there when we decided to write a sequel on our book to concentrate on population extinction and then to give an update of the whole problem.
Amazing. Thank you.
I think all I would add to that is that at that time, one of the things that stimulated us was that more and more papers were coming across our desk documenting that things were actually much worse than we thought they were originally, and that no attention was being paid to what we considered to be the key problem at the time, which was not just the gradual disappearance of entire species, but the fact that the numbers of organisms within species was plummeting everywhere we could look. And in fact, this problem has pursued us to this day. Since after we turned in the manuscript, we have had dozens of papers which have shown more and more that the situation has gotten to be basically untenable.
I like to add that once we published a paper in 2015 is on the magnitude of extinction crisis. And basically, in that paper, once we publish it in Science Advances, one of these very prestigious scientific journal. And every time I got an email about the paper, my heart will be pump, 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 because I said, oh, they maybe discover something that we did wrong. And internally, I will be like willing to say, Gerardo, Paul, you made a mistake. You haven't done the math properly. And so the big number that you find out, the extinction of a species, we find out that the species that become extinct in 100 years would have taken 10,000 years. And unfortunately, it wasn't that case. Unfortunately, our paper stimulate many other papers to be done on microorganisms, plants, animals, all kind of groups of living organisms. And all of them shows that it was a trend, a generalized trend. So I was thinking like it will be so kind of difficult in academic terms to be proven wrong, but it will be so nice in the real life to be proven wrong.
One thing that's important for everybody to understand is that scientists live on their reputations with other scientists. That is, some idiot may go on the TV and say, I deny that there's climate change. That's perfectly okay. Citizens can have any opinion they want, but scientists live by their reputations with other scientists. And one of the things that's been pleasing to me and to Gerardo and to Rodolfo, who is out doing more science in the field just at this very moment, is that we have the full support of our colleagues. That in general, the response is keep saying it, and here's another example, and you're right. And that's very pleasing for scientists because, of course, we all expect to be shown we're wrong. That's how progress is made in science. Unhappily, in this particular case, we're right.
Mm. Yeah, I've come to understand, I'm not obviously a scientist myself, but I've come to understand that there's a culture of erring on the side of caution. Like it's better to be vastly underestimating something than even slightly overestimating it, because then you looked alarmist in retrospect. And so I can see how a culture like that, even though many people behind the scenes agree with what you're saying, might feel fearful to come out and make that case. And in the final chapter of the book, you have a very powerful call to action to other conservation biologists and scientists to really use their voice, which was something I wasn't necessarily expecting to see.
I already have tenure. Uh, I'm actually retired. Uh, so I'm happy to say that in this case, I am an alarmist. And in fact, um, one of the very top, maybe the top scientist in the climate area has actually written about scientific reticence.
Mm,
That is, we all try and be conservative until we really feel the data fully support something. But now, in some areas like climate disruption and the loss of biodiversity, the data have become so massive that we want our colleagues to say, we're alarmed,
mm,
we're scared. This is a terrible thing for our children and grandchildren and great grandchildren.
And for
And
us.
so at the moment, I'm proud to be an alarmist.
mm,
Yeah, I remember when we were having this CBS news program, we were interviewed and there was 60 minutes. And I remember that they said, okay, people say that you're an alarmist. And Paul said, yes, we're alarmists because we're alarmed. I mean, really, we're alarmed. I mean, and when we sent the paper to publication, I remember that one of the editors said, well, this is a great paper, we're going to publish, but the title of your paper is very strong. We're not used to this kind of titles. And I reply and I say, look, we have to be careful not to be alarmist in the sense of not having data to prove it, to exaggerate something.
mm,
But it will be unethical not to tell things as bad as they are. If I go to the doctor and I have cancer and I have cancer stage 2, I don't want him to tell me, "Oh, you are fine," not to make me afraid. I should be very afraid, and I should do everything I can do to get a proper treatment against cancer. This is exactly the same. We
mm,
are being incredibly correct in the sense of what the data say. We have never, uh, actually, we have been very conservative when we publish our papers on our data. We always put the lowest scenario, the most less radical scenario, although some of the other scenarios are much higher. We've always been very conservative because of that. We try to be conservative so other scientists can come and try to see if we're being right in the sense scientifically correct. And that has been the case. But
mm,
yes, first of all, yes, we're alarmed. We're really alarmed about the problem. And second, we are being incredibly cautious scientifically to tell the things the way they are.
mm, mm. I want to follow the loose structure of the book because I thought it was just really deft. You set the scene with what the extinction crisis is and its relationship to past extinctions. So let's start there. How does the well, first of all, what is the current extinction crisis? Like, how do you describe that briefly? And how does it compare to past extinctions? And maybe as a follow up to that, what should we be learning about past extinctions that we're now observing?
Well,
Oh,
I guess the first thing I would say, and then I'll pass it to Gerardo, is that one of the things that is very different about the current extinction crisis is that we know absolutely what the cause is. Um, there are some past extinction crises, particularly the one about 66 million years ago, when the data all indicate that an asteroid hit the Earth. And that one took place even faster than the current one. But the current one, from what we know from the geologic record, and we've worked very closely with paleontologists, with geologists on this, um, the current one may very well be the second fastest of all. Because in geologic time, a crisis that takes 2 million years is an eye blink in geologic time. But we're looking at one that we personally have observed within the lifetime of single individuals.
Mm.
Both of us have seen populations disappear and numbers drop dramatically. So that's a big difference from what we know about most extinction crises. There are about 5 before us.
Yeah, when we start to look at this issue, there was this discussion among scientists. Remember that the extinction is part of evolution. Evolution works as a process where there are extinctions and there are speciation, generation of species. In normal times, there are more species being coming alive than species becoming extinct. That's not normal. So if you look at the last 700 million years, the graph of a species in the planet goes up. In this particular moment, there is a moment where we have more species in the planet than in the last 700 million years. And before, we don't have any records, so we cannot say. But anyway, so when we start to look at that, some people will say, well, we shouldn't worry about the extinction crisis because it's normal. It's part of the normal path of evolution. And then we were lucky when we were discussing this, Paul and I. And one day we come with this paper by one of our colleagues, Tony Barnowski, who has calculated what were the extinction rates in the last million years. So for us, it was like pure gold, because with that, we could then estimate the current extinction and then decide if the data will tell us if we shouldn't worry because this is a normal rate, or we should worry because it's elevated. So we start to do the analysis, and then we were almost sure they will be high, but we were completely unprepared to see the magnitude of the problem.
Mm.
So, in a nutshell, basically what we find out is that the species that become extinct in 100 years, vertebrate species, mammals, birds, amphibians, reptiles, and fishes, the species that become extinct in the last 100 years would have taken 10,000 years, being very conservative, to become extinct. It was between
At the
10,000
normal rate.
as the normal rate. So imagine that the normal rate, we would have lost those species in 10,000 up to 17,000 years under the normal rates. And now we lost them in 100 years. That was
Mm.
the magnitude of the species. And that our paper was published, Accelerated Losses of a Species Extinction, and it became viral. Everywhere it was everywhere. It was covered by most newspapers and all channel news and so on, because it was, I think, three important things. On the one hand, we have been shown that the magnitude was really gigantic, and that should concern us. The second time, that is happening in our lifetime, and it could become even worse. And the last time, and the last thing that we managed to understand is that losing all these species, we were losing the capabilities of the planet to maintain life. So this is what we think was it becomes so viral and so important. It was covered everywhere, and it has become a classic paper on this field. And it's also because we were on the right time to be able to show what was the magnitude of extinction.
Mm. And that's this metric, extinction per million species years, correct?
Exactly, exactly.
Could
That
you?
you can translate that to number of species that become extinct in 100 years per 10,000 species. If you have 10,000 species, for instance, invertebrates, under the normal extinction rate, you will expect to have 2 extinctions per century. And then we have, in 5 centuries, you will expect to have, 10,000, I said, around 40 species to become extinct. And we have hundreds.
Mm.
So. That's the metric. The metric can be translated, fortunately, to that more simple algebraic equation. Okay.
Mm. So you show how more species are going extinct at a much faster rate than they historically what the historical background rates would be. But you also identify this issue of population extinctions within species. Could you talk a little bit about that? Maybe Paul, I'll throw it to you.
Paul, yes, please talk about that.
Well, the basic thing that well, first of all, how did I get involved in this originally? When I was a kid, I collected butterflies, and in the 19 late 30s and 40s, I found that the populations I was working on were disappearing, that I could not raise monarch butterflies in New Jersey because they'd sprayed so much pesticide over the state to kill off mosquitoes that they were also killing off the butterflies. And uh, eventually, my scientific introduction to this began when I started at Stanford, um, working on a population of butterflies on a little bit of Stanford land, the Jasper Ridge Biological Reserve, which is the finest biological reserve on the campus of a university with first rate ecology. And I was interested in the dynamics of a herbivorous, but all butterflies essentially are herbivorous, that they eat plants. They're our biggest insects that eat plants are our biggest competitors for food. And I was very interested in understanding their their dynamics, why the populations got bigger in particular and became pests. And it was a shock to me to discover that the population that I was studying on Stanford land were disappearing. And it never had occurred to me that a small insect could not be preserved in an area set aside for them of something like 1,200 acres. I think like most scientists at the time thought that insects would easily survive on relatively small patches of land. Turns out they don't. Turns out that populations of not of the insects were disappearing, but of course, as we now know, populations of birds are plummeting. The population sizes are going down. I've repeatedly gone back to coral reefs where I worked in the past and saw that the number of fishes there, maybe the same species are present, but very many fewer of them. And the same thing with butterflies, the same thing with birds. And I don't want to rave on, but uh, the situation with insects within the last couple of days, I got a paper done by colleagues at the research station where I worked for decades in the Colorado Rockies. And it turns out that exactly where I had been working, the insect populations have declined in the last 35 years by 50%. That is, the place where I was doing my research, only half as many insects are there now as there were 35 years ago. And there's data from all over the world showing the same thing. And actually, almost every individual in a country like the United States can see it because, if they're my age, because 60 years ago, when you went to a bar, there were lots of moths flying around the neon lights outside the bar. And if you drove a car across country, you had to stop periodically and pick the butterflies out of your radiator of your car. There were so many of them. Those insect we used to think of them as snow flurries of insects at night. They're gone. They're not just gone from the United States, they're gone from Germany, they're gone from Costa Rica, and they're gone from the subalpine area, relatively undisturbed. If you just look at it in Colorado, I say, with a paper that just came to us a couple days ago.
Well, in Mexico, I'm a kind of a weird scientist because I do basic research. I love to do basic research, but also I do a lot of applied things. I set aside based on that research uh, set aside areas for protection. Just recently working with jaguars, we managed the government to set aside 3.5 million hectares, new hectares of tropical forest. Calakmul, Grand Calakmul is one of them, and it's larger than Yellowstone, for instance. And uh, this is one thing. And the other thing I do is, once I was doing my first analysis of prioritizing mammals in Mexico, we prioritize species that were in danger as endemic, the ones who only live in Mexico. You call an endemic species a species that is found only in one place. Endemic to Mexico means it's only found in Mexico. And then when I was doing the prioritizations, there were many species who were in danger with extinction. Some of those were endemic, and obviously, if they become extinct, the whole species becoming extinct. But many of them, like wolves, pronghorn antelopes, tapirs, and so on, endangered in Mexico, but they have populations in other places. So if they become extinct in Mexico, we were losing the populations in Mexico. So at that time, 30 years ago, I was starting to think about that extinction has two components. One, you lose the species, but then this previous to that, you're losing population. Then when I went to Stanford to that's my sabbatical, I started to talk to Paul, and he published a paper with one of his students and his colleagues on populations extinction. Basically, they talk about this issue, and I become very interested because basically it showed what I have been looking at my prioritization data on mammals of Mexico first, and then on mammals of the world later. And then I gathered a data set and sit down with Paul, and we were able to have this data set where we have around 177 species of mammals of the world, and where we have the historic distribution and the current distribution. And basically, by putting those maps together, you could see where all those species were not extinct, were species still alive. So by putting the maps, the historic maps, and the current maps, you could see where you have lost populations. And our data was very surprising because there were places throughout the country, on all the continents, there were places that they have lost between 75 to 100% of the populations of those species. And in this case, it was basically Asia, Southeast Asia, who was the one showing the worst patterns. Uh, we gathered this data, and I think it's the first data who shows explicitly geographic explicit data on species extinction. We published it in Science, and it was a paper on population extinction and mammals. And we find out there that the problem was global. We were losing populations of mammals all over the place. And although most of the data was for large animals, there was data also for smaller animals. And then it shows that even large and small, conspicuous or inconspicuous mammals will become extinct. And there was data from very abundant species to very rare species, meaning that the problem of population losses of individual animals being lost were also generalized from very abundant to very rare. And basically, what we said in that paper, that if you have a very abundant species and you start to lose a lot of population, eventually you will become endangered. And if you have an endangered species and you lose the last few populations, eventually you will lose the last population and the last individual, and you will become extinct. And this is when we start to think about this process of population extinction and how we were missing the point. Scientists, we were missing the point by just focusing on species extinction because we were greatly underestimating the problem. And I give you another example. I work with jaguars in Mexico. So we understood based on our rationale and our understanding of the data that it wouldn't matter at all if jaguars become extinct in Mexico. It wouldn't matter at all if there are jaguars in Brazil, because the role the jaguars play in Mexico, in this forest in Mexico, or in the US or wherever, will be lost. So losing jaguars, populations of jaguars in Mexico or in El Salvador or wherever, will mean that the whole species will become extinct locally, and that will be a big blow to the ecosystem services and benefit that we get from that.
Mm.
And although the species will be still alive, locally and regionally will be a big blow. So basically, this is when we start to push the idea of this book that population extinction is incredibly important, and to understand what are the impacts, what are the magnitude, what are the results of those extinctions on population will give us a much better idea of how is the extinction crisis at this moment.
Mm. One thing that really was really pronounced for me with this book, I mean, you know it intellectually, but just how complex these ecosystems are and how critical biodiversity is, and how rapidly, like you referenced a trophic cascade early on with Steller's cow. Talk to me a little bit about that issue of biodiversity. Like, somebody hearing this might think, okay, it's really sad, like I'm sad to know that this population is going extinct, but like it's actually much worse than just that sadness because of its impacts on the ecosystem. So I want to invite
Biodiversity is the single most valuable resource that humanity has. In other words, when, as Gerardo pointed out to me some years ago, the wealth of nations is how much biodiversity they have, because it's the only resource that we can't do without. In other words, there is this extremely complicated system that we only partially understand. We understand enough to know, like, for example, I don't know how this computer works, but I know pretty well that if I take a sledgehammer and hit it, it's not going to work anymore. And that's the level we're at with biodiversity, which is an extremely complex system that our lives and civilization are utterly dependent on. We cannot get along without it. It supplies us with services human beings evolved to deal with and have to have, and yet we're disassembling it as fast as we can. We have politicians working very hard to wreck it as soon as they can wreck it, even though their lives, their fortunes, their children's lives, and their great grandchildren's lives are utterly, utterly dependent upon it. To give you, we cannot explain exactly what patterns are going to take place as we continue the disassembly. Uh, Gerardo and I got a paper again just a very few days ago that showed that when human beings brought a fungus from European caves to North American caves, it caused a disease that killed off certain bat species, populations of bats. Not the species, but just populations in the primarily northeastern United States. It turns out, of course, that bats are our greatest friends in many respects in agriculture and also in health, because they're very heavily predaceous on insect pests that either eat our crops or carry disease to us. So by moving the fungus, we wiped out the bats, and that resulted in farmers using much more pesticides, which in turn has resulted in increased infant death rates in the areas where the bats have been taken away. So human infants are dying because human spelunkers carried spores from European caves to North American caves where the bats were not already immune to the virus. And there are many, many, many examples of this. For example, for a general principle, things we consider pests normally have very large populations. Very large populations tend to go extinct more slowly than very small populations. So when we wreck a system, we tend to take out the things that have been keeping the pests down. So you're likely to go through a pattern of a relatively balanced system. Then you get rid of the predators and the pests bloom. And then when the pests bloom, human beings start to suffer. And of course, eventually, there's not going to be any nature left. One of the things in the background of all of this is we're rushing towards another silent spring. You kill off the insects, you kill off the birds. The birds sing. Uh, when two of the most famous examples of population extinctions are in Africa and Asia: the African elephant and the lion. And the lion and elephant used to be basically virtually everywhere in Africa, and a lot of lions on into Asia where there are Asian elephants. But um, they've gone away, and many of the countries there are losing valuable dollars, valuable exchange, because the tourists no longer can easily see lions, or in many areas you can't see elephants, and so on. So it's all tied into a very complex system we do not understand well, but we understand more than enough to know we're wrecking it. And boy, are we wrecking it.
There are many reasons to keep animals and plants and species alive. Biodiversity, in its most simple definition, is just the number of wild animals, plants, microorganisms, and fungi in the planet. Okay, so this is a very basic definition, and we know now that those animals and plants and microorganisms are intermingled in very complex ecological systems. We call them ecosystems. And those ecosystems, I mean, those species are incredibly important for maintaining the structure and function of the ecosystems. And as Paul said, we don't know much, but we know enough that one uses disrupt, and we give in the book many examples of that. One uses disrupt some of the species, you take out some of the population, you can change the whole thing. And we have learned in the last 50, 40 years that those species and those the structure and function of ecosystems are fundamental to have life on Earth. So as far as we know, there is only life on this planet, and there is only life on this planet because of the biodiversity. Biodiversity, all these creatures, are fundamental to keep. First of all, to create the conditions to have life on the planet. The atmosphere, the way we have it, is because we have plants and microorganisms and us producing using oxygen, producing CO2, or and so on. So the basic, big ecosystems, processes like primary productivity, climate, and water regulations and so on depends in a large part on the presence of all these plants and animals in an ecosystem. So when we start to take out those species or those individuals, those populations, we start to disrupt the system. We call all the benefits that we get from the well function of nature and all the benefits that we get from free, we call them ecosystem goods and services. And the goods are just basically just making your mind a list of all the things that we get from nature. All our crops from those biodiversity. Many of our medicine, 70% of our medicine comes from that from nature. And as soon as we start to take these species, as we are going to are eroding the capabilities of the planet to maintain life in general and to maintain human lives in particular. We are destroying the capabilities of the planet to maintain the climate the way we know it, to produce the water for us and for everything else. All the fertilization of all the soils in the planet depends on the proper functions of ecosystems. And we have many examples in the book. We have an example, for instance, of the goods that we get from nature. There was this small, really relatively very obscure frog found in Australia. And this is what is very interesting. I mean, a guy found the frog and he was an amateur, herpetologist. So he put it in a jar and took it more than, a few hundred miles to see his friend in a museum who has a herpetologist. He came out, and the story says that they put it there in a place, and they look at the frog, and they went for a while and come back, and there was the frog, two small froglets. And frogs sometimes they have their newborn on the mouth, they look, or in the back. They were not. So apparently they left the frog, and the next day they came out, and there was another froglet. So eventually they look out, and the frog was a female who has ingested the eggs and has finished, the incubation in the stomach. To do that, you have to neutralize the gastric, you know, fluids, so you don't digest the kids. So eventually, one of the most important medicines for reflux, was ranitidine. He came from that proteins coming from that small organisms finding an obscure place in a tiny place in Australia. Unfortunately, the frog became extinct a few years after it was discovered. And right now, in this particular moment, around 75% of all the active compounds or drugs are coming from plants and animals in the wild. I mean, for instance, there is a very promising field looking at the venom of animals and how can you use it for many diseases like diabetes, arteriosclerosis, and so on. A friend of mine
Think
here,
Botox.
yeah, a friend of mine in Mexico, I mean, they found out that the protein in the vampire bat has two proteins. One the vampire bat came and bite an animal, you know, it first of all leak it, and by leaking it, it make it like numb that area. So when it bites, it doesn't feel it, and then it has a protein to keep it the blood flowing without coagulating. And now that protein is one of the most important anticoagulants for medicine and so on. But then we're talking about individual species, but we have a very complex system with 30,000, 40,000 species. Can you imagine how complex it is? So by losing them, we're losing all these capabilities that maintain life on the planet. We're eroding rapidly the capabilities of the planet to maintain life in general and to maintain human life or human well-being in particular. And Paul was talking about pests. And also, this is a very interesting story because pests, you sometimes call pests animals who are very abundant. And I have the case in which, when I was studying prairie dogs in the 1990s, beginning of the 1990s, the species was considered a pest. And many species that in nature have big populations are considered pests because we simply don't know what is the role. So I start to study them with some colleagues, and we find out that they are not pests. They are not only not pests, they are keystone species. Once you remove the prairie dogs, the whole system collapses. And we explain this in the book clearly. We really make a full story of how you lose the prairie dogs, you start to losing the scrubland, start to invade the grassland, and then you lose all kind of animals associated and all kind of plant associated to that grassland. So many times, what we think that a species doesn't have any value to us is simply because we don't know enough about those species. And so why we should protect the species, plants, animals, microorganisms, and fungi? Because they are fundamental to keep the conditions of the planet that give us well-being. There is no way we could keep our well-being if there is no water, if the atmosphere is changing, if we don't have any food resources, if we don't have any sources of new medicines, And there are reasons. There are political, there are philosophical, there are moral, all kind of economic reasons to maintain a species. But basically, as we say in the last part of the book, even if there were no other reasons, we should keep them those species because those species have been fundamental in our evolution. They have been our companions since we were started our journey as a human Homo sapiens, and it's simply morally wrong to see them become extinct.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a quote that I have heard for years that I'm sure you've heard for years. I'm guilty even of saying it around climate change. And the goal of this phrase is to try to put the responsibility on us, but it turns out that I think it misrepresents the picture where it's Earth will be fine. Like humanity might not make it, but Earth will be fine. Referencing kind of these past extinctions and life bounces back. And it's like, okay, sure, like life bounces back after extinctions, but that's so many living beings who are suffering and dying, including us.
Exactly, but that misses completely the point because one of the ways Paul and I and Rodolfo has been raising our voice is because if we let this continue, first of all, we're going to lose all these species. There will never be elephants again, even if their life will continue on the planet. And we think, unless there is a nuclear holocaust or something like that, life will continue on the planet. But if we are very selfish in terms of humanity, it was incredibly difficult to cope in the next decades, looking at so much suffering for, especially at the beginning, from the poor people and the poor nations, and then to everybody will be confronted by destroying nature. It is also, even if you don't mind that life will continue, just we should understand that by losing all these species, by letting this crisis going on, we are confronting us with an immense suffering of billions of people that we think is not correct.
We're destroying the system that allowed us to evolve. And when we destroy biodiversity, we're basically committing suicide. Human civilization is busily in the process of destroying its life support systems.
Mm.
And when you destroy an organism's life support systems, guess what? They all die. And what we're talking about when you think of somebody like Rupert Murdoch, who has been working very hard to make sure that the climate keeps getting worse and worse. And of course, climate disruption is partly caused by destroying biodiversity. And it's one of the major things that's destroying biodiversity that anybody who's ever kept tropical fishes in New York or tried to grow a coconut palm there knows you can do okay in the summer, but when the heater goes off in the fish tank, guess what happens? And when the the garden is subject to a freeze, guess what happens to the palm tree? Biodiversity is utterly dependent upon the climate conditions in which it evolved. And when you change the climate, you are destroying biodiversity. And when you're destroying biodiversity, you're killing millions of people. Rupert Murdoch will have more deaths on his hand than Hitler, Stalin, and various other dictators in the past. He will be the record holder in the future for having caused human deaths. And he is also, I have to say, in my view, the most dangerous immigrant we have ever allowed into the United States. He came from a relatively developed country, but when you hear people claiming that we have problems with immigrants, the first person to think about is Rupert Murdoch.
Here, here.
That is not an official view of Stanford University.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot about the fact that this sixth extinction is underway and why biodiversity is important. You also in the book talk about the drivers of extinction. And I think some folks are familiar with some, but maybe not others. So I'd love to take a moment to talk about the proximate drivers of extinction and the ultimate drivers of extinction. I don't know what you think is the best order to talk about those things. So I'm gonna throw over to you.
I probably talk to the proximate, and Paul can talk to the ultimate. The proximate drivers are human activities. Our population has grown so hard, and our consumption that basically were causing a lot of problems. In terms of the impact on biodiversity, we can say the habitat loss and habitat destruction is one of the first ones. I mean, we continue destroying the environment, mangroves, the oceans, and all kind of things, tropical forests, and so on. And that's one of the main causes, and also overexploitation. For instance, all our fisheries in the planet, 90% of the fisheries are overexploited already, and soon all of them will be overexploited. So basically, we're taking too much of the system, We're taking animals and plants over the carrying capacity of the environment. Then the traffic, the illegal trade of animals is gigantic. China get more than 100 million, according to their own statistics, 100 million large animals being sold legally or illegally in the country every year.
Mm.
The money that they got from that is larger than the beef production of the U.S. And they say that the illegal trade is so big that it is, in terms of the money earned, almost as large as drugs, with almost no penalties on that. And then we have toxification, all the chemical pollution of the environment, and then we have pollution with plastics and so on, and invasive species. We all know, for instance, the case in Everglades, where the Burmese python has been introduced, and they say that there must be more than 1 million now that have literally wiped out most of the mammals, birds, and reptiles and amphibians of the Everglades. And finally, diseases. Introduce diseases, and all those are like the causes, proximate causes of our activities, where with so many people and so many demands, so much consumption, we're really putting a big impact. Just to give you some examples of the data, in 1970, there was, large part of the planet were already being impacted. But anyway, since 1970 to present, we have lost almost 60% of all the forests and all the ecosystems that we have in the 1970s. Just from 2000 to 2000 to now, we lost 90% of the tropical forests in Southeast Asia. And we have lost around 70% of all individuals of animals, some animals, in the last 40, 50 years. And the big catastrophe they call the insect Armageddon is happening in the last 2 decades. As Paul said, I remember perfectly that you were driving in Mexico and you have to stop in the gas station. There was a guy, that will specifically be hired to clean up your windshield and to go to your radiator and take out all the butterflies and moths and insects who were there. And that, with my students, I was telling them about these issues last year, and we were in Calakmul, one of the tropical forests better protected in Mexico and in Latin America. And we drove for 5 hours, and we have two insects hitting the windscreen. There are none. They're basically gone. And those are the causes, the main causes of the proximate causes of extinction.
Mm.
And the ultimate cause is very simple, but complex in a way too. First of all, there are too many people for the system to support. The system is running down, our resources are running down, but we're trying to take more and more from less and less to support more and more people and more consumption. And for instance, when we began to move, Homo sapiens, modern Homo sapiens has a roughly 300,000 year history. And we've only been screwing things up for a small proportion of that, the last 10,000 years, roughly, starting with agriculture. The numbers of people until very recently did not seem to be affecting the resource base of the planet. But with industrialization, that has changed totally. When we started with agriculture, there was copper almost lying around on the surface at 100%. You didn't have to go to ore, you could just get the copper. Nowadays, you go down a mile or so to dig up ore that's a few percent copper and have to smelt it, which means you've got to mobilize other resources to get the little bit of copper. The biggest study of the economics of biodiversity was done by Sir Partha Dasgupta, the world's leading economist, for the British government, with the support of the British government, in a huge study now known as the Dasgupta report, and people should look it up. It's easily found. And Sir Partha estimated that the planet might be able to support 3.5 billion people, more or less permanently, if all those people were willing to live at a Mexican standard of living. And today we have 8 billion people, with more than half of them struggling to live a Hollywood standard of living, even though they're desperately poor and badly nourished and so on and so forth. So the number one ultimate cause is overpopulation leading to overconsumption of resources and reduction in the quality of life for everybody. But of course, it's much worse for the very poor people in the world who are kept poor because of the behavior of the very rich people in the world. The world is an inequitable place. And if you don't have equity, you're going to continue to have huge battles and wars and possibly a nuclear holocaust, the odds of which are going up all the time. But, when you say, oh, well, it's just hormone mimicking substances that we're breathing or drinking in the water. Why? Because more and more people are demanding more and more products made with chemicals that mimic our hormones and therefore, among other things, appear to be uh, reducing our sperm counts. We may actually find out that we've managed to fix ourselves, so that we'll go back to the days in the women's lib movement when they say a woman without a man is like a fish without a bicycle. The sperm counts are dropping. That's not the preferred course to take, but of course, human beings should be paying much more attention to inequity and family size and family planning and education for uneducated people and for redistribution of wealth. But boy, if you talk about redistribution of wealth, the morbid billionaires like Peter Thiel uh, hate the idea. And the very, very rich are only too willing sometimes to give a little bit of money for, quote, charity, end quote. But they're not willing to give up their elite positions and their personal overconsumption, which is, I mean, if you take a look at who's the name of the world's greatest overproducer, um, who owns X
Oh,
and
Elon
owns a
Musk.
whole Elon Musk, yeah. 13 children. He's a true idiot. And yet he's using huge amounts of resources uh, that are badly needed for other people on preposterously stupid plans, like he's going to occupy the entire universe and is going to terraform Mars. That is, convert Mars into a planet like Earth, which is very funny because, of course, he and his buddies are Martian forming Earth. We are changing Earth to be more and more like Mars, not vice versa. And yet, here we go. The ultimate causes are too many people, too much consumption, growth mania, which infests both the Republican Nazis and the Democrats. You got to keep growing, and more growth just means sooner and sooner death. And we work very hard at that. And we see the signs everywhere. I mean, people ought to be aware of climate disruption, even though one of the major political parties, unfortunately, has a program of getting rid of any effort to deal with climate disruption. Um, and too many people also do things like produce too much plastics. Recent studies showed that surgeons removing plaque from the carotid arteries of patients examined the plaque they had removed. That's the goo that blocks your arteries and gives you heart attacks. And they found about half the patients had lots of tiny little bits of plastic in their plaque. That is, little jagged pieces of plastic in the gunk that's clogging their arteries. Worse than that, the half of the people that had the plastic were the ones most likely to have heart attacks and die. And that's what our wonderful economy is giving us. I can testify to something that Gerardo and I think you can't testify to. It was perfectly nice to have a wonderful life in the 1940s, if you weren't in Europe, uh, without plastics, without um, uh, digital TVs, et cetera, cell phones. Most of the crap that we produce adds to the atmosphere things that are terrible for human beings and other animals and sometimes plants. And that's part of the wrecking of the systems because we have no We never evolved to have long-term judgment. Human beings are highly cooperative animals that until the time of the agricultural revolution never had the capability to become racist or have classes and so on, and we've never really developed the ability that came originally with us coming out of the water and being able to see in distance. The idea of really doing planning. We don't plan, we don't look to the future. So the fact that we are undermining our very lives is unknown to 99% of human beings. End of lecture. End of sermon. Excuse me.
Gerardo, I don't know if you had anything you wanted to add to that.
Basically, Paul has and we have mentioned like the proximate and the ultimate causes. And one thing we like to mention is like, although it is incredibly complex, the ecological system is incredibly complex, and the biodiversity and extinction touches all the angles of the economy, of the stability in the economy, in the society, and in political, from local to global. We also have been thinking about, and what he mentioned, the wealth of nations, is that this biodiversity has been ignored in the economic systems, regardless if they are more leftist or more rightist or whatever. And we have been pushing the idea that you can incorporate, the cost of maintaining biodiversity, that will be the cost of maintaining us, to maintain civilization, and that cost will be relatively small in terms of the size of the economy of the planet. And even if it's not small, it's a necessary, it's the next step we have to be done. And we mentioned that the wealth of nation is the most important thing, because you can survive an economic crisis and a political crisis, a social crisis, and there are examples everywhere, from global to local, and we won't be able to survive if there is this environmental collapse uh, associated to biodiversity, uh, partly is continuous. And we think that one point that we were discussing the other day is that in most of the places we live, we say the cost of protecting nature. And if you really think about it, it's not a cost. It is an investment. It's an investment that will give you probably a smaller return than if you invest in terms of money, yeah, you invest in oil. But if you invest, if you put a lot of money in protecting nature and restoring nature and adapting to all these changes that we are confronting, we're basically, on the one hand, producing a lot of work, infrastructure, and wealth. I mean, in the normal sense of for people. But on the other hand, you are protecting the system that allows to be here. So we think that there has been like the wrong idea. What is the cost of protecting nature? In these terms, I mean, what is the cost of saving us from pollution? What is the cost of maintaining more protected areas or more ecosystems? It's actually that cost, really, in terms of economic terms, so most people will understand, it's an investment, and it's an investment on us. And usually I put this example: if you go to the doctor and you have, let's say, $1 million, and you go to the doctor and the doctor say, well, Gerardo, you have this cough, and it's a bad cough, but don't worry, we can fix it. We can fix it for $50,000. And I said, and if I don't fix it, well, you will die. I said, well, $50,000, that's really a lot of money. That's what we're looking at. I mean, the cost, whatever will be the cost, and the cost is manageable, but whatever will be the cost of investment in protecting nature and trying to face the big problem that we have is small when we think about that what we at stake is the future of mankind, of humankind.
You spend a good chunk of the book toward the end talking about possible solutions. Um, and you're clear to point out that these are not like magic wand fixes. Um, but I wanted to invite you to share some of those, responses that might lead to healing some of the harm that we've done?
I'll start, but Gerardo will do better because he personally has preserved more biodiversity than any scientist I know. So he's a specialist in that. But my view uh, at another level is that we have to completely change our educational system. For example, uh, as far as I know, there's no university in the United States, certainly not Stanford, where I was a faculty member for something like 6 decades, uh, doesn't require that every incoming student have a course that teaches them why nuclear war is getting more likely and what close calls we've had in the past, how ecosystem goods and services support our civilization and are absolutely essential, and so on. When you hear even politicians that I like, I once had a very good interaction with Joe Biden, but whenever I hear Joe talking about increasing the size of the economy and not mentioning giving better equality to women so that they reproduce less, so that there's less reproduction, or ending that sort of thing, uh, I get very depressed because our so called educated people are mostly utterly ignorant of what's going on in the world and the level of transformation that will be required to do the things that Gerardo will suggest. Um, is very, very high because the changes are so dramatic and will require so many changes in behavior that we're going to have a highly educated population that understands it. Imagine, for example, uh, what most people would say when you tell them we have to basically stop producing SUVs and, in fact, design our automobiles to be used by groups, not by individuals, because mostly they just use resources and sit there, and we can reduce the amount of liquid fuels that we use for surface transportation dramatically if we change our habits, if we change from building more and more suburbs to tearing down suburbs, converting them into farms, and concentrating people in larger and larger cities until we can reduce gradually and humanely the population to a maintainable level and so on. That sort of thing is not going to work unless we have an educated public. And sadly, even most people in universities have not the slightest clue how the world works. There's a new book by Vaclav Smil, who's a specialist in energy, called How the World Actually Works, which would be good reading for every high school student in the country and would start us after they've read Before They Vanish, of course,
Of course.
uh, uh, into understanding what needs to be done so that we can start moving towards a world that's both fairer and more sustainable. But there are lots and lots of individual things that can be done, and Gerardo can explain how he has saved vast amounts of biodiversity personally.
As Paul said, well, we cover in the book just a few examples of the myriads of things that you can do for conservation, and we just put some examples because it's so bad you could write several books on that. But basically, one of the things that we really think is like, first of all, nobody's really in charge of saving the planet. I mean, there is like the COP, meetings and this, or the IUCN, but really we tend to think that in conspiracy theories that the US or the China or Russia or the big corporations are managing the way this works. It isn't. It's basically there is a big lack of leadership where we can really put the effort and the funds required to do this gigantic challenge. So that's the first thing to do. Is like we really need to think about what are the structure or what are the structures or what will be the best way to go in terms of trying to address it. For instance, the COP meetings. The new one will be yeah, on climate change in Colombia, biodiversity in Colombia. So what's the point? I mean, they are non-mandatory. I mean, none of the countries. I mean, most of the countries are not doing it, and they are not trying to reach the goals. The U.S. hasn't signed some of them. China also hasn't signed up some of them. So that's kind of we have this. We feel good, but it's not working, and it's not going to take us out of this. So, in summary, we really need to have to think about what will be like the institutions that we need to cope with this, and then what is the effort, the economic effort to do it. But then there are many other things we can do. And in the book, what we basically have done is to put this kind of thing to call attention to the things that need to be done globally and it hasn't been done, or what can you do at the national level or a regional or personal level. For instance, at the personal level, you can do many things that can really help the environment or at the regional level. But unfortunately, unless this is being done now at the global level, articulated in such a way that is the resources that really the resources that are needed are to put into the work and are to put into solving this problem, it won't work. But anyway, there are many things you can do at the individual level. And for instance, if you are more affluent, you can buy things that impact less the environment. You know, you should never buy things that are a product coming from endangered species. You should never have wild animals as pests. For instance, the pest trade in the U.S. is so big, and unfortunately, it's causing so many problems. Like for instance, there is another disease that came out from Asia to Europe and to Australia, and then to the U.S. and Mexico and South America that has destroyed probably 200 species of amphibians, of frogs and frogs and toads, and we know so little about it. But anyway, so the trade is not good, you know.
Mm,
And at the globe, I mean, at the more at the national level, one thing that you should be very careful, and you can really influence how your country is doing, is who do you vote for? I mean, you really should be thinking about voting for the people, for the party, for the person who stand up and trying to face these gigantic problems with no excuses, you know. I mean, many people, many politicians say in Mexico, the US, or wherever, oh, this is not a real problem. The real problem is the economy. The real problem is that we don't have enough people. The real problems are the refugees. The real problems are the Supreme Court or whatever, you know. That's nonsense. I mean, the real problem is that we're not facing and we're not putting enough people, enough funds, enough resources to save the biodiversity and to create the conditions that biodiversity offer wealth to people. And just recently, I was driving in the U.S. And well, man, I was a few months ago. I was driving from Boston to the north, looking to the what last year, looking to the changing colors of the forest, and literally, I drove for hundreds of kilometers. You know, where there were forests, incredibly nice forests, and they were not protected legally. I mean, there were forests that has been set aside as forests and they are being used and they're being utilized, but they are really important. And the people there have a much better standard of living with those forests than people who are next door in places that those forests has been destroyed. So protecting what we have. It is imperative that we protect all the ecosystems that are still around. We're talking about 48, 58, 50, 40% of all the environments. And we
mm,
should do that within protected areas or without protected areas. In Mexico, let me give you an example. We have been working in this region called Calakmul, next to the Guatemala border, and it's one of the places with most biodiversity in the planet. Definitely one of the most biodiverse places in the Americas. And there are jaguars, tapirs, eagles, and all kind of animals, monkeys, and so on. And in that place, we have instrumented what we call a conservation payment program, where we pay the local people to protect the forest, and they can use the forest in many ways. The only thing are not allowed to do is to destroy it. You know,
mm,
cut it down for wood or to cut it down for cattle or agriculture. And it has been incredibly successful because the local people really love the forest. I mean, they know that having the forest protect them with against climate. You know, they can go and maybe sometimes hunt a deer or hunt some animals to eat. They can go and get some forage for their animals and so on. And we have been able to put this incentive of giving some money as a rent. Let's say as a rent, when you have a house, you rent it, the same thing, and it works really well. So we need to look at this kind of innovative mechanisms to protect those forests, to protect the mangroves, to make better use of our ecosystems. And there are literally, I wouldn't lie to say, there are literally thousands of examples of things that are working. By the way, this project in Mexico has increased the size of the populations of jaguars and many endangered species. The local people is having a much better standard of living, and in terms of stability, one of the most stable, politically stable places in the country, because the local people, the people who usually are prey of the bad guys, don't have to go to the to illicit activities because they have a nice standard of living without doing illegal activities.
I have to mention a paper that came out a few years ago that showed that in a rich country like the United States or most of Europe or Japan, Australia, that giving up having an additional child is equivalent to stopping 22 people from driving entirely in terms of environmental saving.
Wow.
That is, over reproduction is one of the most dangerous things in terms of environmental deterioration. And I also can say that in the United States, right now, the single most important thing for the environment that any American can do, by far the most important that every individual who's a citizen can do, is work as hard as possible to defeat every Republican in the coming election. That is, the Republican Party has announced that it wants to destroy the life support systems of our civilization. It's already destroyed the program that was established to warn us of pandemics. It is already trying to forbid the use of the term climate in any government thing. That wants to end the possibility of the government regulating the amounts of pollution in various places and so on. Not to say that I'm any great fan that, the governments always do the right thing. But when you have a huge overpopulated world, you have to have mechanisms for dealing with things like the biodiversity crisis. And we have the opportunity in the United States for everybody to do something to save their grandchildren, their great grandchildren, and their descendants further on down from either dying early or having a miserable life. And that's something individuals can do. And I have to say, every single scientist I know agrees with that and agrees, for example, that any charitable operations they have at all must now go to supporting the Harris Words Hertz ticket, because we have an opportunity now as individuals to do something that's extremely important for our descendants and for our species. And we cannot let that one go by. And it will require effort beyond the election, even if the right person gets into the White House.
And I think what Paul said, covers pretty well also this issue. But what I like to point out that in the book we have make a big effort to write it in such a way that is understandable for most of the public, not a specialized public. Um, and the book, we have made an effort to show the problem, to show the causes, the consequences, and what we can do. And I don't know if you agree or not, but we try to put some anecdotes, some interesting ideas, some good examples of things that happen, so good examples of things that are not good. I remember that we wrote about this guy who was trying to save the last rhinos in northern Africa, And I found this story very compelling in how he single-handed tried to deal with one of the most ruthless guerrilla groups in the war. This particular one found in the Congo, and he was very successful at some point, and it was a single individuals. So single individuals, groups of individuals, can make a big difference. And that's probably one of the most important things of writing this book for me. And it's incredibly difficult to write a book in English and to synthesize so much information, is to try to make people, first of all, aware of the problem, and then also to give some hope. Maybe we are kind of late, but we need to keep hope. We need to keep on working. We need to understand that the war is not done. It's not finished. There are many battles. We're losing most of the battles. We're winning some of them. And the I hope the book can bring some people to think about these issues and to act.
One of the nice things about human beings is that we know they can change their views and behavior very, very rapidly when they understand the situation. See, I remember what it was like after December 7th, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, and a country that was largely isolationist, that did not think it should be involved in European affairs and so on and so forth, turned around almost instantaneously. In December 1941, I believe we had produced about 4 million automobiles, passenger cars, that year in the United States. And for the next few years, we didn't produce passenger cars for civilians. We produced tanks and airplanes and so on. And a lot of people went off to fight on various principles. And we showed, and similar things happened in other countries brought into that horrible war. And so we know that human beings, when they understand a situation, can really take rapid action. And we're hoping against problems like the new digital world and so on, that human beings can once again, because we've bravery is a characteristic of human beings. Working to save the group is characteristic of human beings. We got to where we are today, dominating the planet, by being ultra social, by being super cooperative. The time has come for us to cooperate for everybody, not just to cooperate for our people or our religion or our group or our nation or our city or anything else, but for humanity, because it's humanity that's at stake. And all people basically have the same characteristics and deserve a happy life just as much as those of us on this show deserve a happy life. Amen.
Amen to that. Well, just to reflect back, I as a reader of the book, um, I definitely, I think, had the intended effect. Going into detail, not only of the moments of hope, but also all the populations and species we've already lost, and understanding how special those species are, and understanding that wherever you come into the issue, like whether it's just for the intellectual knowledge, whether it's for the development of medicine or new science, or just a simple fact that it's sad that that species no longer exists on the planet, it matters. It matters that they're gone. And for me, it really induces a feeling, first of all, of sadness, but then second of all, of it, we really must act to protect what we still have.
Well, that's basically. I mean, to be honest, I do a lot of conservation because I understand I have to do it in society with people and so on. But for me, particularly, my goal in life is to save as many species of wild plants and animals as possible. I mean, I know that I have to interact with people. I have to do protected areas. I know I have to make the livelihood of the local people better, and it's great. But the bottom line is that there are 8 billion people in this planet. Talking about people, there are very few people who are like the voice of nature. And we, in this book and in our work, try to be part of that voice, try to be part of those animals and plants and who doesn't have a voice, who can tell us how do they suffer, how do they feel, why do are becoming extinct, And it's incredibly important for us to be uh, filling that gap and filling that hole and try to be part of that voice of those creatures who are disappearing because of our activities. It's completely unethical to not to be to understand and to be aware that they are becoming extinct because of us, and depending on us if they are going to survive. But paradoxically, if they don't survive, we won't survive.
I think I speak for Gerardo as well as myself that among the times we've been happiest together was doing field work in Costa Rica on various aspects of biodiversity. And the idea that some people never have that experience, that some people have never been in a tropical forest and seen the incredible organisms that live there, or on a coral reef and so on, is really sad. And we're removing those opportunities progressively for future generations. It's super sad because it's a wonderful world full of interest and so on. And why some people want to convert us to a battery chicken life in which everybody has a room somewhere and just barely enough to eat and no outside nature to appreciate or no scenery, just is ununderstandable to me, and I suspect to Gerardo and most of my colleagues.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, there's so much more to say, so much more to ask you both. But of course, that's why people should go get the book. You've been tremendously generous with your time. I like to close all of these episodes with three questions that I ask each guest. So I'm gonna kick those off. Paul, I'll start with you since at the very beginning, Gerardo, I started with you. So, what's one thing you wish people paid more attention to?
I wish more people paid attention to the enormous, not just economic value, but survival value of biodiversity, that it become one of the central things that everybody learns about from kindergarten till old age and pays attention to.
Mm. Gerardo?
Well, I think like definitely I will really love that people will pay more attention to protecting nature for all these reasons that I have mentioned. And I will be incredibly happy if people will put more attention to save nature just because it's beautiful. And I remember Jan Dors, who was a important biologist from France, who said, "One, we need to protect nature because it's beautiful, and we also need beauty in our lives."
Mm. Paul, back to you. What is one resource you use or recommend for making better sense of reality?
Well, I think as a pedant and an ex university professor, I find the most useful thing today, although it's getting harder with my vision reduced, is Google Scholar. It's one place you can go on the web and at least get reference to scientific papers. It doesn't mean that there aren't, the oil industry has created scientific, in quotes, journals to put it out their propaganda, but mostly you can judge better from Google Scholar when you're interested in a technical issue, um, by going over the summaries, seeing where they're published, uh, knowing what some of the best and most dependable journals are. Uh, just going to the web, you've got to have a lot of background to sort the shinola from the you know what. But Google Scholar is the resource I depend on mostly as an elderly scientist.
Amazing. Gerardo?
Well, I don't know if I understood correctly the question, but I think I will like to spend. I mean, I will people will spend more time in nature, in their backyard, in their gardens, in the city parks, and the more affluent or the ones who can go to go out to enjoy just to see nature. I mean, I have a ranch. I go every weekend, many weekends I can, to walk around and. it's incredible how many things I can see all the time that are new to me, even having in those places some many times, and just by becoming interested in the flowers or in the birds or in the insects, it's just so much joy, so much interesting, and it's also on the one hand make you feel that how this incredible work is being put together, in terms of evolution and ecosystem function and services. But on the other hand, it's also to understand the value. With Paul early, we were discussing with Paul a book whose Immense World is called. And in that book, it's just full of so many interesting examples of things that we know now already, and just by reading them and to see how things work and how are the sensitive things of animals and how sensible are animals. Well, the other thing that I have been incredibly perplexed in the last few years, now that Instagram, now that everybody has a cell phone, and there is Instagram or Facebook on all these social channels, uh, um, to see people walking in the field and see like animals doing behaviors that it will be, I mean, literally impossible to me to really think that it will happen, like a crow eating a piece of bread on the road, and there is a rat on the corner, and he breaks a piece of bread and go and drop it to the rat. And you say, well, that's maybe a coincidence, but he does it 3 times.
Mm.
Or like a fish who's jumping like outside the water, and you see a heron coming in and say he's going to eat it. No, he will put it by the tail and drop it into the water. So there is so much going on in terms of the conscience, in terms of the understanding that we don't know about nature, about animals, that I found that an immense source of joy, just to be learning all the time on those social media things.
Mm. I like to hear a positive outcome from social media. And the final question is, what is one moment when your sense of reality was disrupted?
The main one for me was when I suddenly realized that my assumption about my butterfly population on Stanford land was going to go extinct, and that the 1,200 acres that had been set aside for it weren't enough. Uh, that brought home to me in a way that many other things I had learned about, but that was the one that told me that my own work was going in the wrong direction. In that case, that I was studying that population for the wrong reason, and that there was a much bigger story uh, involved. And yeah, that was uh, an awful moment. Let's put it that way
Mm,
for me.
mm,
I will mention an awful moment of the reality, but also a completely different reality check. And the first one is like while I was driving, I wrote a book called the Endangered Fishes of Mexico. And in the cover, we have an endangered fish who was a tiny fish endemic to just a single spring in northern Mexico. And I was driving, and then somebody said, "Okay, Gerardo, can you lend us the photograph of that species because we want to use it?" And it wasn't my photograph, so I called the author, and I couldn't find it. So I called somebody else's who has one population. It has become extinct in the wild, and I called him and I say, Arcadio, will you mind if I can lend? I can go and take a photograph of this species because I want to use it in a nice place. And he said, Gerardo, I'm sorry to tell you, but that the species became extinct 2 years ago. And I was driving, and it was really such shock, that I had to stop the car and get out and move around and say, "Fuck, this is so bad. This is so." That was I tried to check. It says this is extinction going on right now. So it was I didn't expect it at all, and that was a really bad thing that happened. And there are other things like that. But on the other hand, the one thing that really also checked me positively in a few years ago, it was we organized a jaguar census in Mexico in 2010. And we expect to find 1,000 animals, and we found 4,000. And then we repeated in 2018. And things have been, there has been more habitat destructed, more things, but we have done a big effort in Mexico to at least be more aware of that. And when the data came, I have with my friends and my colleagues, and they came and said, Gerardo, we have the data. We know now how many jaguars we have. And I was very scared. What is this? And I said, the good news is that there are 4,800 jaguars now. And it really revived me. It really got me, give me some faith and some more strength on keep on going, because we're talking about jaguars. We're talking about 10 years of 8 years in going in the wrong direction, habitat destruction, more pollution, and so on. And here we are with jaguars being alive, more jaguars, and we are repeating the census this year. And so far from what I have seen, there will be more. So these are the kind of reality checks that sometimes put you down, and other times give you enough strength to keep on going. Because once, and I will finish soon, somebody asked me, how can we go around with this burden, like Paul and I, that we discovered that we are in the 6th mass extinction and so on. I don't know, probably those magic small moments in which I think what keeps me going and doesn't get me depressed to the sense that it's clinically depressed is that I know my work, I know our work, I know our papers, our book are making a tiny difference, but making a tiny in the right direction. And it also makes you humble, because we are just one or two individuals. What else we can do to change that? And being so insignificant in terms of the whole population, we have been able to push some ideas, important ideas, at the global level, and that somehow keep me going.
Incredible. Well, yeah, you've definitely had an outsized impact on protecting what's precious on this planet. So Before They Vanish, available September 17th. I'm hoping to have this episode out by then, but in case it's a week later, then it'll already be out. Either way, it's on bookstores or on bookshelves and online. Is there anything else about the book that we didn't touch on that you'd like to share here?
Well, the book has a really nice illustrations and really nice photographs also. The illustrations were done by a nice colleague of ours, Daryl, and the photographs are my photographs. So this also shows the beauty on the ground. The photographs are about the beauty, and the illustrations are about the situations of some species. So I think it's also nicely the text is nicely complemented with the illustrations and the photographs.
That's where I can speak out, because with my declining eyesight, I have no responsibility directly for the illustrations. But Darrell Way, who did a set of drawings for it with captions that she worked out, she's a pioneer in what she calls science art. She and Don Kennedy wrote a book on science art. And I think what you do and what she does is equally important to what uh, Gerardo and Rodolfo and I do. Namely, uh, is the science is one thing, but getting the word out is really critical, and getting it out with good illustrations. And Gerardo has been doing it for years with his photography. And I once took a picture too, but it's hard to remember when. But the book, the science art in it, I think, is also exemplary, and I'm very happy with it. And Darrell Way deserves a lot of credit for that.
Well, I agree. The illustrations are great. They give you a sense of the interconnectedness, and these sort of peak moments of particular species, and the captions too. They're jam packed captions. They're definitely not ones to pass over either. So yeah, couldn't agree more.
Thank you very much for the exposure. We appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time to be on Urgent Futures.
Thank you.
This podcast is edited and produced by Adam Labrie and me, Jesse Damiani. The podcast is presented by Reality Studies. You can learn more by visiting realitystudies.co. And if you appreciate the work I'm doing, please subscribe and share it with someone you think would enjoy it.